I need to warn you. There's something you should know about the mountains near my town. Something they don't want you to know. I don't care anymore. I've seen too much to stay silent. I know because I was there. I saw what happened. And you need to know, so it doesn't happen to you too. It's been months, and I still can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see the trees twisting in on themselves, hear the faint hum of something ancient in the wind. I should have never gone out there. Let me tell you how it started. In late summer of last year, I got a call from an old friend, Eli. We hadn't spoken in months, but when I saw his name flash across my phone, I picked up immediately. Eli had always been a bit of a thrill seeker, the kind of guy who loved to push boundaries. So when he suggested a weekend trip to an isolated cabin in the woods, it wasn't out of character. I found this place online, Eli had said, excitement clear in his voice. It's perfect, deep in the mountains, no cell service, no distractions. Just the four of us, a fire and some beers. What do you say? I hesitated at first. Something about the idea of being completely cut off from civilization didn't sit right with me. But Eli was persistent. He always had a way of convincing people to go along with his wild ideas. Eventually, I agreed. A weekend away from the stress of everyday life sounded appealing. No work, no emails, no noise. Just a few days to unwind with friends in a quiet, peaceful cabin. We had no idea what we were walking into. The day of the trip, we piled into Eli's beat-up SUV and set off towards the mountains. There were four of us, me, Eli, his girlfriend Sarah, and my cousin Daniel. The drive was long, winding up through narrow roads that snaked around the cliffs. The higher we went, the thicker the trees became, their shadows stretching across the road like long, spindly fingers. By the time we reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place looked old. Older than I expected, but sturdy enough. It was a small wooden structure with a stone chimney, tucked away in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The kind of place that didn't look like it belonged on any map. Eli was thrilled. "This is it," he exclaimed as we pulled up to the front. He jumped out of the car and stretched his arms, taking a deep breath of the mountain air. Sarah followed him, camera in hand, snapping pictures of the trees and the cabin like we were on some sort of nature retreat. Daniel and I exchanged glances. I could tell he was just as uneasy as I was. The cabin itself was simple. No electricity, no running water. Just four walls, a roof and a fireplace. But there was something about it. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. But Eli waved off our concerns, as always. "Come on, it's perfect. We'll have the fire going in no time. Trust me, you're going to love it." The first night passed uneventfully enough. We built a fire, cracked open some beers, and sat around telling stories. The stars were bright, the air was crisp, and for a while, I started to relax. Maybe I'd been overthinking it. Maybe this trip would really be a nice escape. But then, the second night came. That's when everything changed. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought I was hearing things. just the wind moving through the trees. But the longer I listened, the more I realised it wasn't the wind. It was something else. A low murmur, faint but persistent, drifting in from the forest. I turned to Eli. "Do you hear that?" He frowned. "Hear what?" "That noise," I said, lowering my voice. "It sounds like whispering." Eli shook his head, taking a swig of his beer. "Dude, it's just the wind. Relax." But I couldn't relax. The whispering wasn't going away. If anything, it was growing louder, like it was getting closer. Daniel must have heard it too, because he was looking into the trees with a concerned expression. "It doesn't sound like wind," he said quietly. Sarah was the next to speak. "It's probably just animals," she offered, though her voice wavered slightly. "We're in the woods after all." But I knew it wasn't animals. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out the words. It was like a conversation, like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping each other in a language I didn't recognise. By the time we decided to head inside, the whispers were nearly deafening. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We stayed in the cabin, huddled around the fire, listening as the whispers circled the clearing outside. Every so often, one of us would glance towards the window, half expecting to see something out there. But there was nothing. Just the trees swaying in the breeze and the endless, maddening whispers. By morning, the whispers had stopped. The forest was silent again, but none of us felt any relief. Whatever had happened the night before, we weren't imagining it. "I don't like this," Daniel said, as we gathered around the fire to discuss our next move. "There's something off about this place. We should leave." Eli was unusually quiet, staring into the dying flames with a furrowed brow. He hadn't said much since the whispers started. Sarah looked nervous too, biting her lip as she wrapped her arms around herself. "I agree with Daniel," I said, breaking the silence. "We should pack up and get out of here. This place, it doesn't feel right." Eli finally spoke up, his voice quiet. "We'll leave tomorrow morning. I don't want to drive down those mountain roads in the dark." I didn't like the idea of staying another night, but I knew Eli had a point. The roads were dangerous enough in daylight, and navigating them at night would be asking for trouble. We reluctantly agreed to wait until morning, but none of us were prepared for what would happen that night. The sun set slowly, giving an eerie glow to the surrounding trees. The light felt off somehow. The unease that had settled over us the previous night returned, but it was more palpable now. We didn't know what to expect. And then, just after sunset, the cabin began to change. It was subtle at first. The firewood we'd gathered earlier seemed to shrink, the logs smaller than I remembered. The cabin walls creaked and groaned, the wood warping as if the structure was contracting, tightening around us. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She stood in the centre of the room, looking around like the walls might close in on her at any second. Eli didn't respond. He was staring at the door, his face pale. Then came the voices. Not whispers this time. Voices. Clear, sharp, and terrifyingly close. They were coming from outside the cabin, from the woods. Deep, guttural voices, speaking in a language I didn't understand, but filled with an anger I could feel in my bones. "They're here," Eli whispered. "They're watching us." "What are you talking about?" Daniel snapped. "Who's here?" Eli didn't answer. He just kept staring at the door, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sarah backed away, her face drained of colour. "We need to leave, right now." She was right. We couldn't stay there another second. Whatever was out there, whatever was surrounding the cabin, it wasn't human. We grabbed our bags, throwing on our coats as we prepared to leave. But when I reached for the door, something stopped me. The cabin was in a different place now. I know how that sounds. It's impossible, right? A cabin can't just disappear while you're standing inside it. But that's exactly what happened. I opened the door, and instead of the clearing outside, there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of darkness, like the world had been swallowed whole. I stepped back, my heart racing. What the hell? Eli looked over my shoulder and went pale. Where are we? Daniel moved to the window and froze. "It's gone," he whispered. "The forest, the trees, everything. It's all gone." I ran to the window, expecting to see the familiar sight of the clearing and the thick forest beyond. But there was nothing. Just the same inky blackness, stretching out in every direction. The cabin was floating, suspended. In what? I didn't know. A void, maybe. Some kind of empty, featureless expanse that defied everything I knew about the world. "We're not in the woods anymore," Eli whispered. We're somewhere else." Panic set in quickly after that. We spent hours trying to figure out what had happened, how the cabin could have just vanished from the forest and ended up wherever we were. But there were no answers, no clues, just the black vacuum outside and the growing realization that we were trapped. It wasn't long before the voices returned. They echoed through the cabin. They weren't coming from outside anymore. They were inside with us, moving through the walls, the floor, the air. We could feel them, their anger, their hatred, closing in on us like a predator circling its prey. Sarah started crying, her hands clutched to her chest. "What do they want?" she sobbed. "Why are they doing this?" None of us had an answer. We couldn't even agree on what they were. Eli thought it was something supernatural, some kind of ancient force that claimed the cabin and anyone who stayed there. Daniel thought we'd been sucked into a parallel dimension, trapped in a place that wasn't bound by the rules of reality. Me? I didn't know what to think. I just wanted to survive. We had no choice but to stay within the cabin, wherever it was. We began to think it was all over. By the third night, the cabin began to deteriorate. The walls creaked and groaned like they were being crushed, bending inward, shrinking the already small space into something terrifyingly claustrophobic. The air became thick, humid, making it harder and harder to breathe. Even the floorboards started to bend under our weight, warping like wet cardboard. We tried everything to escape, banging on the walls, shouting into the void outside, even breaking a window in the hope that we could climb out. But it was useless. Every time we tried to leave, the cabin twisted itself, closing us off, trapping us inside. And then, on the fourth day, Eli disappeared. We woke up in the morning and he was just gone. No warning, no sign of struggle. It was like he had simply evaporated, erased from existence without a trace. That's when we realised we weren't just trapped. We were being hunted. Sarah broke down after that, curling up in the corner and refusing to move. Daniel and I did our best to keep it together, but the reality was sinking in fast. The cabin, whatever it was, wherever it was, it wasn't going to let us leave. One by one, it was going to take us. By the fifth night, the cabin was barely recognisable. The walls had collapsed inward, the ceiling sagging so low we had to crouch to move around. Worse than that was the voices. They were in our heads now, not just around us. I could hear them even when I covered my ears. Their angry, primal words drilling into my skull like nails. The strangest thing about all of this? None of us felt any hunger or thirst. It was as though we'd all been trapped in a moment in time. Either that, or maybe we were all already dead. It would make sense. This felt like a hellish hallucination. It wasn't long before Sarah disappeared too. That left just me and Daniel. We knew it was only a matter of time before the cabin took us as well. The walls were so close now, the space so tight, we could barely breathe. We spent the last night huddled together, whispering prayers to gods we didn't believe in, hoping for a miracle. It felt as though we were trapped in purgatory. Would this be our existence forever? But there were no miracles in the cabin. I woke up on the seventh day, and Daniel was gone. I don't know how I made it out. Maybe I was the last one they needed. Maybe they were toying with me, letting me live just long enough to see my own inevitable fate. But when I opened my eyes on that seventh morning, the cabin was back in the clearing. The forest was there, the trees swaying in the breeze, the sun shining down through the leaves. Everything was normal, except the cabin. It was empty. No sign of Eli, or Sarah, or Daniel. No sign of a struggle. Just an old, weathered structure, standing alone in the woods, as if nothing had ever happened. I ran. I didn't look back. The authorities didn't believe me, of course. They searched the cabin, but there was nothing to find. No bodies, no clues, nothing. I pleaded with them that my friends were missing and that something horrible had happened to them, but they wouldn't listen. Bizarrely, they couldn't find any records of Eli, Sarah or Daniel at all. It was as though they'd never existed. The police treated me like a crazy person, someone who must have hallucinated on some strange drug out in the wilderness. I even tried visiting their families, but at each address, a completely different family was living there. They all looked confused when I told them that my friends were living there. All of them had been living there for years. My own family even denied that I had a cousin. This didn't make sense. I felt like I was going crazy. I was watching the news absent-mindedly one morning, with a coffee in hand. I'd been losing my mind. Had I imagined the whole thing? I'd tried relentlessly to find evidence of my friends, but there was nothing. All of my pictures with them had either disappeared or they were no longer in the picture. Something on the TV broke through the haze. Apparently, a wildfire had spread through the woods we were at just a few days ago. There was nothing but ash now. This seemed like a huge coincidence. I had to see for myself. I had to make sure that the cabin couldn't do this to anyone else. So without a moment's hesitation, I picked up my car keys and drove in earnest to the woods. It was as though I was on autopilot. As I arrived, it was true. Devastation everywhere. Ash and dust where green trees and foliage once stood. I walked into the woods, trying to retrace the steps we'd taken just a week or two ago. I saw a few landmarks that couldn't be mistaken. We definitely passed the stream, and that rock formation looked familiar. I assumed myself lost until I spotted something in the distance. No, it couldn't be. How is that possible? Amongst the grey and white ashes and the charred trees stood a familiar structure. It looked incredibly out of place, as though it had appeared there just moments ago, untouched by the wildfire. I couldn't believe it. The cabin looked identical to when we first came across it. Without thinking, I turned again and ran. I couldn't risk going inside, not after last time. But at least now, I knew I wasn't crazy. I had to warn people. The authorities still wouldn't believe me, but I can put up posters. I can tell people on the internet. I must have spent days, weeks, posting on every internet forum I could find, warning people not to enter the cabin in the ashes. Most ridiculed me, but some believed me. A few even wanted to find the cabin themselves. So perhaps I've done more harm than good. So please, if you're hearing this, don't let curiosity get the better of you. You might disappear like my friends, or worse, be the last one left. You might be left with your own guilt, questioning your sanity like me, because I'm sure the cabin still sits there, waiting for the next poor unfortunate souls to enter. And I'm certain, now more than ever, that it's hungry.